Welcome to the deep dive. If you're listening, you're probably someone keen on understanding the forces, the undercurrents really shaping our world.
Especially in areas like energy and industry, vital sectors.
Exactly. Whether you're preparing for important discussions, maybe aiming for a really solid grasp of a subject, or, just driven by curiosity, we're here to help cut through the noise.
And today, we're tackling something pretty significant happening in U.S. energy policy. President Trump has recently designated coal as a mineral.
Yeah, that caught my eye too. It sounds like just a word, but it's not just some administrative tweak, is it? It seems to have real weight for energy, the environment, the economy.
Oh, absolutely. It's got ripple effects.
And for our listeners, particularly those of you keeping an eye on, say, the UPSC exams, this is definitely a development worth understanding for current affairs. So our mission today.
To really get into why this decision was made, what could it mean, both domestically in the U.S. and maybe globally?
And explore those underlying tensions, right, between, growing energy needs and our environmental goals. We've dug into recent reports to pull out the key insights.
Okay, so let's start with the headline news itself. President Trump has designated coal as a mineral.
Right.
Now, this wasn't completely out of the blue. The report we looked at from the Indian Express points out there was some groundwork laid earlier, back in April 2025.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
An executive order was exploring classifying coal, specifically coking coal, which is vital for making steel, as potentially a critical mineral and also a critical material.
Okay, so mineral is the label now, but critical mineral and critical material were part of the conversation. Can you break down what critical mineral means in the U.S., like legally or officially?
Sure. The U.S. Energy Act of 2020 has a definition that says a critical mineral is basically a non-fuel mineral or material that's essential for the country's economic or national security.
Okay, central.
And importantly, it has a supply chain that's vulnerable to disruption. Think, things we need for tech or defense where we might rely on imports.
Got it. And critical material, does that add anything specific?
It often reinforces that idea of being vital for manufacturing. So mentioning both really underlined the focus on coal's industrial uses, especially that coking coal for steel.
Right, so applying this mineral tag now implies the administration sees coal in a similar light, essential, maybe vulnerable. What's the strategic thinking here? What's the goal?
Well, the main goal seems pretty clear from the reporting. It's about prioritizing projects to extract coal here in the U.S. and really trying to boost domestic production overall.
Which fits with the broader push for, reviving American manufacturing and achieving energy independence we've heard about.
Exactly. It's about having more control over energy resources, reducing reliance on foreign suppliers.
Yeah.
That's the core idea.
Makes sense from that strategic angle. But what about the specific energy security argument? Why coal? Why now? What makes it so critical at this moment?
A key justification being highlighted is coal's role in stabilizing the power grid.
Ah, reliability.
Yes, especially with energy demand shooting up from things like AI data centers. They need a huge amount of power consistently.
And renewables like solar and wind, while crucial, they fluctuate, right? They aren't always on.
Precisely. So coal is being presented as that reliable baseload power source. You can sort of count on it.
Consistent power.
Yeah. The executive order itself apparently described coal as abundant and cost-effective and capable of meeting these new demands from AI and growing domestic manufacturing.
Interesting. Is this view unique to the U.S. right now?
Not entirely.
Yeah.
The report we read also mentioned that you see rising coal use in places like India and China, often cited for, well, grid balancing.
Really? Why there?
Often is because rapid industrial growth is kind of outpacing how quickly they can build out renewables and the necessary storage. So they lean on coal for that consistent power needed for economic expansion.
Okay, so the rationale is becoming clearer. Energy security, grid stability, industrial needs, AI demand. How does this designation actually translate into action? What changes on the ground?
Well, that brings us straight to regulations. The administration has been actively relaxing various environmental rules that affect the coal industry.
Such as?
Things like rolling back requirements for certain emissions control technologies on power plants and also trying to streamline the whole process for getting permits to mine coal, cutting down on bureaucratic hurdles.
Less red tape, fewer emission rules. Sounds like a direct attempt to make coal more economically attractive again.
That seems to be the intention, trying to breathe life back into the coal sector. Its share in the U.S. energy mix has fallen quite dramatically.
Yeah, the numbers are stark, aren't they?
They really are. The Indian Express mentioned it dropped from around 40% back in 2014 down to something like 15% in 2024. That's a huge slide.
So this is meant to reverse that decline and presumably help industries that use coal.
Yes, particularly industries like steel and cement that rely heavily on that coking coal we mentioned earlier.
Right, tying back to strengthening domestic supply chains. So it's not just about electricity, it's securing materials for other key industries too.
Correct. Reducing import dependence for those materials is part of the picture. And it's interesting, there's a parallel in India noted in the report.
Oh.
Their policy think tank, NITI Aayog, has apparently also suggested classifying coking coal as critical. He suggests a kind of similar concern about securing resources for their own industrial base.
Fascinating parallel. Let's circle back to AI for a moment. That connection seems really important in driving this, the sheer amount of electricity needed.
It really does seem to be a major factor. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, has forecasts suggesting data center electricity use could actually double by 2026.
Double? That's staggering.
It is. It's a massive new load on the grid that needs to be met somehow.
Now, I know some big tech companies like Google and Microsoft are making deals for nuclear power. That seems like a cleaner approach.
That's true. They are exploring options like nuclear. But the government's perspective here seems to be broader. More like we need all reliable options on the table, and that includes revisiting coal.
So positioning coal as maybe a bridge fuel, a transitional thing.
That seems to be part of the argument, yes.
Yeah.
A transitional fuel that provides stability while we figure out large-scale energy storage to make renewables more consistently available until that tech fully matures.
Okay, but, and this is a big but, we absolutely have to talk about the environmental side, the climate impact. Coal is the most carbon-heavy fossil fuel.
And that's precisely where the major counterarguments come in. They're very significant concerns.
Understandably.
If we see a big resurgence in coal burning, it could seriously jeopardize hitting climate targets, both national ones and the global efforts like the Paris Agreement goals. Net zero ambitions become much harder.
So critics are saying this could undo progress.
Yes, the argument is that unless there's massive immediate investment in things like carbon capture and storage CCS technology to trap the CO2.
Which is still expensive and not fully scaled, right?
Exactly. Without that, boosting coal could effectively reverse the gains made in cutting greenhouse gas emissions over the last few years.
And the administration's response to these environmental concerns, how are they addressing that?
From the reporting, it seems they tend to downplay the immediate urgency. They frame existing emission standards as maybe too burdensome, too restrictive, perhaps technologically premature for wide application right now.
So prioritizing the energy security and economic aspects over the immediate climate worries in this calculus.
It appears that way, yes. The weight seems to be heavily on energy security and economic growth in this specific policy move.
It helps to put this in a global perspective, too. You mentioned earlier that the EU already lists coal as a critical raw material.
Yes, that's important context. The EU does include coal, often specifically coking coal, on their list. So if the U.S. formalizes this mineral classification, it's not entirely alone. It joins other nations reevaluating coal's strategic role.
And India's thinking on coking coal fits this pattern, too.
Right. It suggests this isn't just a unique U.S. phenomenon. There seems to be a wider trend of countries trying to secure resources they see as vital for energy or industry, even if it involves difficult environmental trade-offs.
So a broader pattern of nations prioritizing energy security, maybe alongside, or even sometimes over, environmental goals, especially with rising demand and geopolitical uncertainty.
That seems to be a fair reading of the situation. There's this tension between immediate needs and long-term climate commitments playing out in several places.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. So the key takeaways are, the Trump administration labels coal a mineral, driven by wanting energy security, supporting domestic industry, and meeting rising power demand, especially from AI.
Right, and the strategy involves easing regulations on coal mining and use.
But this comes with really significant environmental baggage. Concerns about derailing climate goals are substantial.
Definitely. And globally, we see this isn't happening in a vacuum. Other nations are also reassessing coal, particularly certain types, for strategic reasons.
So it really represents a kind of strategic pivot, or maybe a reemphasis, in U.S. energy policy balancing those immediate needs against the longer-term climate picture.
A very complex balancing act indeed.
And for you, our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC exams, this whole discussion, energy policy, environmental rules, global economics, critical resources, it's all highly relevant stuff for Maine's current affairs and gives useful context for prelims, too.
It certainly leaves us with some big questions to think about, doesn't it? How do nations balance the immediate energy hunger of new tech like AI with the absolute need to shift to cleaner energy?
Yeah, that's the core challenge.
And what are the real long-term consequences if we prioritize energy security using older carbon-intensive fuels?
Yeah.
Especially when the climate crisis is already here. There are no easy answers.
Definitely food for thought. If you found this deep dive helpful, please do give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and definitely leave a comment if you have more questions or thoughts.
We appreciate the engagement.
And just to mention, the information we've been discussing today draws heavily from a recent report in the Indian Express. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.